In the winter of 1895, the world stood on the precipice of a war that would have rewritten the entire history of the 20th century. It was not a war between Germany and France, or Russia and Japan. It was a war between the two greatest English-speaking powers on Earth, the United States of America and the British Empire. On paper, it looked like a suicide mission for the Americans. The British Empire was the hyperpower of the age. Its navy, the Royal Navy, was larger than the next two navies combined. It controlled the global telegraph cables, the banking system, and the trade routes. If war broke out, British battleships could have anchored off Sandy Hook and turned New York City into a pile of rubble within days. They could have strangled the American economy with a blockade that would have frozen every factory from Boston to Baltimore. The United States had a tiny standing army, a second-rate navy, and a coastline that was largely undefended. But the United States had one card to play. One devastating strategic ace up its sleeve that terrified the planners in London more than any battleship. That card was Canada. To the British, Canada was the jewel of their North American possessions, a loyal dominion that spanned a continent. To the Americans, in 1895, Canada was something else entirely. It was a hostage. The American war plan was brutal and simple. If the British Navy attacked the American coast, the American army would simply walk north. There were 3,000 miles of border, mostly undefended. The British could not possibly defend it all. The United States realized that while they couldn't win a war on the ocean, they could win a war on their own continent. They could hold the entire Dominion of Canada ransom. They essentially put a gun to the head of the British Empire's favorite child and said, "Back down, or we pull the trigger." This is the untold story of how the United States weaponized geography to humiliate the most powerful empire in human history. It is the story of how a dispute over a jungle border in South America turned into a threat to wipe Canada off the map, and how the threat forced Britain to surrender its dominance in the Western Hemisphere forever. To understand why the United States was willing to threaten a fellow democracy with invasion, we have to understand the psychological state of America in the 1890s. The country was unrecognizable from the fractured nation that had fought the Civil War 30 years earlier. It had undergone a metamorphosis. By 1895, the American frontier was closed. The great project of Manifest Destiny, the relentless march from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was complete. The indigenous tribes had been subdued. The railroads were built. The steel mills of Pittsburgh and the slaughterhouses of Chicago were churning out products faster than the country could consume them. America was vibrating with industrial energy, but it was also anxious. It was a giant that had outgrown its cradle. The Depression of 1893 had left the economy in ruins. There were labor strikes, riots, and a deep sense of social unease. The political class in Washington, led by President Grover Cleveland, needed a distraction. They needed a cause that could unite the angry workers of the North and the resentful farmers of the South. They found that cause in a concept known as jingoism, an aggressive, chest-thumping nationalism that demanded respect on the world stage. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire viewed this American rise with a mixture of condescension and alarm. The British ruling class, the Victorian aristocracy, still saw the United States as a chaotic, uncultured experiment. They knew the Americans were rich, but they didn't consider them a great power. In the British worldview, power was measured in colonies and cruisers, and the U.S. had neither. Britain was busy managing a global empire that covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface. They were worried about the Russians in Afghanistan, the French in Africa, and the Germans in Europe. They did not spend much time thinking about the Western Hemisphere. They assumed that the Atlantic Ocean and the Royal Navy were enough to keep the Americans in their box. But the tectonic plates of history were shifting. The United States was no longer content to be a regional player. It wanted to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 declaration that warned European powers to stay out of the Americas. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine had been a bluff. The U.S. had no way to enforce it, but in 1895, for the first time, they felt strong enough to try. The spark for this confrontation came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a steaming, malaria-ridden stretch of jungle in Venezuela. For 50 years, Britain and Venezuela had been arguing over the border between the independent Republic of Venezuela and the British colony of Guyana. It was a dispute over maps and survey lines that nobody cared about, until they found gold. A massive gold strike in the disputed territory changed everything. Britain, acting like the imperial power it was, simply expanded its claim. They drew a new line, the Schomburg Line, and said, "This is ours." Venezuela was helpless. They appealed to the United States for help, portraying Britain as a bullying monarch, seizing land from a sister republic. In Washington, this resonated. It looked like exactly what the Monroe Doctrine was designed to prevent, a European empire carving up American territory for profit. President Cleveland decided to make a stand. He didn't just want to help Venezuela, he wanted to send a message to London. He wanted to tell the British Empire that the days of doing whatever they pleased in the Americas were over. The opening shot was fired not by a cannon, but by a diplomat. His name was Richard Olney, the U.S. Secretary of State. Olney was a hard-nosed corporate lawyer from Boston, a man with a bulldog temperament who hated diplomatic niceties. In the summer of 1895, Olney sat down and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government that is now legendary for its arrogance. It became known as the Olney Corollary, or simply the 20-inch gun because of its explosive impact. In the note, Olney didn't ask Britain to arbitrate the dispute. He demanded it. He lectured the British Prime Minister on history and law, but the core of the note was a single breathtaking sentence. Olney wrote, "Today the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Fiat is law. It was a declaration of absolute supremacy. Olney was telling the British Empire that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States was the judge, jury, and executioner. If Washington said the sky was green, then in the Americas, the sky was green. When this note arrived in London, it landed on the desk of Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister. Salisbury was the antithesis of Olney. He was an ancient, bearded aristocrat who had been running the empire for years. He read Olney's note with bemusement. To him, it sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. The idea that the United States, a country with a navy smaller than Chile, could give orders to Great Britain was laughable. Salisbury made a fatal error. He decided to treat the Americans like children who needed a timeout. He waited 4 months to reply. When he finally did, he sent a polite but firm rejection. He tore Olney's legal arguments to shreds. He denied the validity of the Monroe Doctrine. He essentially said, "We will do what we like with our colony, and you will stay out of it." Salisbury thought that would be the end of it. He assumed the Americans would read his superior logic, feel embarrassed, and back down. He completely misunderstood the American mood. When Salisbury's reply hit Washington in December 1895, President Cleveland went nuclear. He felt personally insulted. The British hadn't just said no, they had patted him on the head. Cleveland decided to escalate the conflict from a diplomatic dispute to a threat of war. On December 17, 1895, Cleveland sent a special message to Congress. He asked for funding to create an American commission to determine the true border. That sounded reasonable. But then came the threat. Cleveland declared that once the U.S. decided where the border was, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any attempt by Britain to hold territory on the other side of that line. Resist by every means in its power. In diplomatic language, that means war. The reaction in the United States was instantaneous hysteria. The stock market panicked, but the people cheered. Congress voted unanimously to support the president. War fever swept the nation. In Irish-American neighborhoods in Boston and New York, men poured into the streets celebrating the chance to finally fight the British. Militia regiments began drilling in town squares. The newspapers printed maps of British Guiana and editorials demanding that the British lion be skinned. In London, the public was stunned. They had no idea the Americans were so angry. They woke up to headlines saying that the U.S. was threatening to invade Canada. And that is where the strategic reality began to sink in. This is where the story shifts from political posturing to cold, hard military calculus. As the war scare heated up, generals and admirals on both sides began to look at the maps. The British Admiralty was confident. In a naval war, it would be a slaughter. The Royal Navy had roughly 50 battleships. The U.S. Navy had a handful of modern vessels. The British plan was classic. Blockade the American coast, shell the major coastal cities, and destroy American commerce. They could starve the U.S. economy into submission within months. But the British Army was a different story. Britain had a small professional army, mostly scattered across India and Africa policing the empire. They did not have the manpower to invade the United States. They could burn Boston, but they couldn't occupy it. The United States, however, had the Canada card. Canada was the weak link in the imperial armor. It was a massive, sparsely populated territory with a 3,000-mile border shared with the United States. The majority of Canada's population lived within 50 miles of that border. American war planners knew they couldn't stop the Royal Navy, but they knew the Royal Navy couldn't sail to Chicago. The American strategy was simple: invasion. The plan, which would later be formalized as War Plan Red in the 20th century, but existed in concept in 1895, called for rapid thrusts into Canada at key strategic points. The first target was Halifax. Halifax, Nova Scotia, was the primary British naval base in North America. It was heavily fortified, but if the U.S. Army could cut the rail line connecting Halifax to the rest of Canada, the base would be isolated. The second set of targets was Montreal and Quebec City. These were the heart of French Canada and the commercial hubs of the Dominion. An American column marching north from New York State could reach Montreal in days. If Montreal fell, the St. Lawrence River was closed and Canada was cut in half. The third target, and the most critical theater, was the Great Lakes. The U.S. industrial heartland bordered the Great Lakes. The plan was to seize the Welland Canal and the rail junctions in Ontario. By occupying the peninsula of southern Ontario, the U.S. would paralyze Canada's industry and agriculture. Finally, out west, American troops would move north from Seattle to seize Vancouver and the naval base at Esquimalt. The centerpiece of the American strategy was the Canadian Pacific Railway. The CPR was the only spine connecting Canada from east to west. It ran dangerously close to the American border for hundreds of miles. All the Americans had to do was cut that track in a few places, in Maine, in the prairies, in the Rockies, and Canada would cease to function as a unified state. It would break into isolated pockets that could be devoured one by one. To the British, this was a nightmare scenario. They realized that Canada was essentially indefensible. To defend that border, they would need hundreds of thousands of troops they didn't have. They would have to transport an army across the Atlantic while under threat from American commerce raiders. And there was another, darker element to the hostage strategy. The Americans knew that Canada was politically fragile. It was a confederation of provinces that didn't always get along. There was a belief in Washington, perhaps arrogant but prevalent, that many Canadians would actually welcome an American invasion, or at least wouldn't fight too hard to stop it. They believed that French Canadians in Quebec had no love for the British Empire and would sit the war out. So the deal was on the table, implicit but clear. If you use your navy to destroy our coast, we will use our army to erase your empire from North America. We will take Canada, and we will never give it back. In London, the cabinet met in a crisis atmosphere. Lord Salisbury looked at the reports from his military advisors, and the arrogance of the previous months evaporated. The First Lord of the Admiralty admitted that while the Navy could punish the Americans, they could not save Canada. The Governor-General of Canada sent panicked dispatches warning that the Canadian militia was ill-equipped and that the border fortifications were rotting ruins. But the military problem was only half the story. The financial problem was worse. The United States and Great Britain were the two largest trading partners in the world. British investors owned billions of dollars in American railroads, mines, and factories. The City of London, the financial capital of the world, was deeply intertwined with Wall Street. When the threat of war became real, the markets crashed. This became known as the Panic of 1895. British investors saw their portfolios evaporating. The banking elite in London went to Salisbury and told him the blunt truth. A war with America would cause a financial apocalypse. It would bankrupt the British Treasury and cause a run on the pound sterling. And then there was the geopolitical isolation. Britain prided itself on a policy of splendid isolation, standing apart from the alliances of Europe. But suddenly, isolation didn't look so splendid. It looked dangerous. In Europe, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was building a navy to challenge Britain. In Africa, the Boers were arming themselves against British rule. In Asia, Russia was expanding toward India. Britain was overstretched. If Britain committed the bulk of its fleet to a war in the Atlantic against the U.S., the empire would be naked everywhere else. The Germans could strike in the North Sea. The French could move in Africa. The Russians could march into Afghanistan. Salisbury realized he had walked into a trap. He had picked a fight over a worthless piece of jungle, and now he was risking the entire British Empire to win it. He had to ask himself, was the Schomburg Line in Venezuela worth losing Canada? Was it worth bankrupting the City of London? Was it worth leaving the home islands defenseless against Germany? The answer was obvious, but backing down was incredibly difficult. The British Empire did not surrender. It did not take orders from upstart republics. To accept the American ultimatum would be a humiliation that would ring around the world. It would be an admission that the Pax Britannica was over. Salisbury stalled. He looked for a way out. A face-saving compromise that would avoid war without looking like total capitulation. Fate intervened in January 1896. On the other side of the world, in South Africa, a British colonial raid known as the Jameson Raid failed miserably. It was a botched attempt to overthrow the Boer government. It was embarrassing, but manageable, until the German Kaiser got involved. Kaiser Wilhelm sent a telegram, the famous Kruger telegram, congratulating the Boers on defeating the British. It was a deliberate public insult to Queen Victoria. The reaction in Britain was explosive. The anger that had been directed at the Americans vanished overnight and refocused on the Germans. The British public filled the streets, singing Rule Britannia, not to threaten New York, but to threaten Berlin. For Lord Salisbury, the Kruger telegram was a gift from God. It gave him the political cover he needed. He could now go to the British public and say, "We cannot fight the Americans because we must focus on the true enemy, Germany." He used the German threat as an excuse to fold his hand in the Americas. The surrender was polite, diplomatic, and total. In February 1896, the British government signaled to Washington that they were willing to talk. They dropped their refusal to arbitrate. They accepted the American demand for a commission. They essentially agreed to let the United States decide where the border of their own colony should be. This was the moment the British Empire officially acknowledged the United States as the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. The hostage had served its purpose. Canada was safe, not because Britain could defend it, but because Britain had agreed to America's terms. But the capitulation went deeper than just Venezuela. The crisis of 1895 triggered a profound psychological shift in the British ruling class. They engaged in a cold-blooded assessment of their future known as the Great Rapprochement. They looked at the industrial statistics. They saw that the United States had more coal, more iron, more people, and more money than the United Kingdom. They realized that they could no longer compete with the Americans. If they tried to remain rivals, they would eventually lose. So they decided to do something unprecedented in the history of great powers. They decided to voluntarily cede power to their rival. They decided to make the United States their best friend, whether the Americans wanted it or not. Over the next few years, Britain systematically dismantled its power structures in the Americas and handed them to Washington. First, they gave up the rights to the Panama Canal. For decades, Britain had blocked the U.S. from building a canal alone. After 1895, they tore up the old treaties. They told the Americans, "Go ahead, build it, own it, fortify it, it's yours." They handed the keys to the most strategic waterway of the 20th century to the U.S. Navy, asking for nothing in return. Next, they settled the Alaska border dispute. There was a long-running argument over the border between Alaska and Canada. In 1903, Britain sat on a tribunal and voted with the Americans against the Canadians. They sold out Canadian interests to keep Washington happy. Now, the Canadians were furious, but London didn't care. Canada was the hostage that had to be appeased to keep the Americans from attacking. Finally, the military withdrawal. The Royal Navy, which had patrolled the Caribbean for 200 years, packed up and left. Admiral Jackie Fisher, the head of the Navy, recalled the North America and West Indies squadron. He scrapped the gunboats and brought the battleships home to Europe. Britain essentially demilitarized the Western Hemisphere. They accepted that they could not defend their possessions there, so they outsourced their defense to the United States. They gambled that the Americans, now undisputed masters of the continent, would be benevolent overlords. The consequences of this hostage crisis defined the modern world. By holding Canada hostage, the United States didn't just win a border dispute. They forced the British Empire to fundamentally alter its grand strategy. If the US and UK had gone to war in 1895, the 20th century would have looked completely different. Imagine a world where the two great English-speaking powers were enemies. When World War I broke out in 1914, the United States would likely have remained strictly neutral, or perhaps even sympathetic to Germany, Britain's enemy. Without American loans and supplies, Britain might have collapsed in 1916. Instead, because Britain swallowed its pride in 1895, a special relationship began to form. It wasn't a relationship of equals. It was a relationship of a rising superpower and a declining empire managing its retreat. For Canada, the lesson was stark. They realized that their mother country, Great Britain, could no longer protect them. In fact, Britain was willing to sacrifice Canadian land and interests to appease the Americans. This realization began the slow drift of Canada away from the British orbit and into the American economic and cultural sphere. Canada realized that its security depended not on the Royal Navy, but on maintaining good relations with the giant to the south. For the United States, 1895 was the coming-of-age party. It was the moment the country realized its own strength. The U.S. had stared down the greatest power on earth and won without firing a shot. The Fiat Islah note wasn't just arrogance, it was a prophecy. The U.S. proceeded to act as the policeman of the hemisphere, intervening in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Mexico over the next 2 decades, secure in the knowledge that no European power would dare stop them. Today, the U.S.-Canada border is known as the longest undefended border in the world. We see it as a symbol of friendship. But we forget that in 1895, that lack of defense was a weapon. It was the knife held to the throat of the British Empire. The Venezuela Crisis serves as a reminder of how brutal geopolitics can be. We like to think of the US and UK as natural allies, bound by language and culture, but in 1895 they were rivals, playing a zero-sum game for survival. Britain lost the standoff, they were humiliated, they were evicted from the hemisphere, but in their defeat they displayed a kind of genius. Lord Salisbury and his successors realized that the American rise was inevitable. By surrendering early, by giving up Canada's security and the Panama Canal, they bought the goodwill of the monster that would eventually eclipse them. They lost the battle for the Americas, but they secured the ally that would save them from extinction in 2 world wars. So, the next time you look at a map of North America, remember the winter of 1895. Remember the invasion plans, the panic in London, and the telegrams that almost set the world on fire. Remember that the peace we enjoy today wasn't inevitable. It was bought with a threat to turn the snows of Canada red with blood that terrified an empire into submission. The United States held Canada hostage. Britain paid the ransom. And the American century began. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the American Empire, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories. And let me know in the comments, do you think the US would have actually gone through with the invasion of Canada if Britain hadn't backed down? I'll see you in the next one.